The laughter started before I'd even taken off my jacket. I was standing in the doorway of the Whitfield family's summer house on Ocean Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, holding a bottle of wine I'd picked out that morning because I thought it might soften the entrance, and 40-some relatives I barely knew were looking at me like I'd walked into the wrong wedding. Preston Whitfield, my wife's cousin, had a drink in his hand and a grin on his face that told me he'd been waiting for this moment for years. "Oh my God," he said, loud enough for the whole patio to hear. He actually came. Somebody laughed. Then somebody else did. Then it wasn't a ripple anymore, it was the whole yard, 40 people in linen and boat shoes laughing at a man standing in a doorway holding a $200 bottle of Bordeaux like it was a peace offering nobody wanted. Somebody in a pale blue polo I didn't recognize actually pointed at me, the way you'd point at something surprising in a nature documentary. A woman near the drinks table said, not quietly enough, "I genuinely didn't think he'd have the nerve." Another voice, a man's, said, "Give him credit, that takes something," and I couldn't tell if it was meant as an insult or a strange kind of respect, and honestly, 6 years into that family, I'd stopped being able to tell the difference between the two, because with the Whitfields they usually arrived wearing the same tone of voice. My wife's uncle, Walter Whitfield, was sitting at the head of the long table under the string lights, and he was the only person on that lawn who wasn't laughing. He set down his glass. He stood up slowly, the way men do when they've spent a long career learning that silence gets more attention than volume ever will. And in a voice that didn't need to be raised to cut through 40 people laughing, he said one sentence that stopped the entire party cold. "Sit down," he said, "before you all embarrass yourselves in front of the only person at this table who's actually built something." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed, really. My wife Elena's hand found mine, and I could feel it shaking. Her father, Charles Whitfield, had gone pale at the head of the table, the same shade of pale you go when a deal you thought was locked starts coming apart in a boardroom. I want to tell you how we got to that lawn, because the story of how I ended up standing in a doorway being laughed at by a family that had spent 6 years pretending I didn't exist, and how their own uncle was the one who stopped them, is the kind of story that only makes sense once you understand everything that came before it. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 41 years old. I run a logistics software company out of a converted warehouse in Providence, Rhode Island, 20 minutes from the very street where that reunion happened. I started the company 11 years ago with a laptop, a used Honda Civic, and $8,000 of savings that I'd scraped together working nights as a warehouse supervisor while I built the first version of the software during the day. Today that company employs 61 people and does work for 3 of the 5 largest freight carriers on the East Coast. None of that mattered to the Whitfields. Not one bit of it. Because to them, before I was any of that, I was just the man from Pawtucket who married into their family, and in their world, where you come from is a permanent address that no amount of success ever really changes. I met Elena Whitfield 9 years ago at a fundraising gala for a children's literacy nonprofit in Providence. She was 27, working as a junior curator at a small art gallery downtown, and she had this way of talking about paintings like each one had a secret she was the only person who'd bother to find. I was 32, 3 years into building my company, still driving that same dented Civic because I was putting every spare dollar back into payroll. We talked for 2 hours that night. She didn't know what my company was worth. She didn't ask. She asked what I loved about the work, which nobody had asked me in a long time, and I fell for her somewhere between the second glass of wine and the moment she laughed at something I said and covered her mouth like she was embarrassed to be enjoying herself that much. I met Elena Whitfield 9 years ago at a fundraising gala for a children's literacy nonprofit in Providence. She was 27, working as a junior curator at a small art gallery downtown, and she had this way of talking about paintings like each one had a secret she was the only person who'd bother to find. I was 32, 3 years into building my company, still driving that same dented Civic because I was putting every spare dollar back into payroll. We talked for 2 hours that night. She didn't know what my company was worth. She didn't ask. She asked what I loved about the work, which nobody had asked me in a long time, and I fell for her somewhere between the second glass of wine and the moment she laughed at something I said and covered her mouth like she was embarrassed to be enjoying herself that much. We dated for almost a year before I ever met a single member of her family, and looking back now, I think that gap tells you something important, though I didn't see it clearly at the time. Elena kept those two parts of her life carefully separate, the woman who stood in front of a Rothko and told me exactly why it made her chest ache, and the daughter who went quiet and careful the moment her mother's name showed up on her phone. I remember one night, maybe 8 months in, when Diane called during dinner, and I watched Elena's entire posture change before she'd even answered, her shoulders coming up toward her ears, her voice shifting into something brighter and more performative than the voice she used with me. I asked her about it afterward, gently, and she laughed it off, said her mother could just be a lot sometimes, and I let it go, the same way I let almost everything go in that relationship, because in the beginning, letting things go felt like patience, and it took years for me to understand it had actually been the first rehearsal for 6 years of exactly the same pattern. I didn't meet her family until 8 months in, and when I did, I understood immediately what I was up against. The Whitfields were the kind of old New England money that doesn't announce itself loudly, it just sits there in the room, in the antique furniture and the framed photographs of ancestors who'd apparently done something important with a shipping company in the 1800s, letting you know exactly how far you had to go to ever be considered enough. Charles Whitfield, Elena's father, ran a chain of private marinas up and down the Rhode Island and Massachusetts coastline, inherited from his own father, expanded modestly, never taking any real risk because the foundation had already been built by someone else 2 generations back. Her mother, Diane, sat on the boards of 3 different arts councils and had never worked a paying job in her life. Her brother Tanner managed one of the marinas and considered that management. The first dinner I had with them, Charles asked me what I did. I told him I built software that helped trucking and freight companies route their fleets more efficiently, cut fuel costs, reduce empty miles. He nodded slowly, the way you nod at a child explaining a school project, and said, "So you're in trucking," and moved on to ask Tanner about a boat he was thinking of buying. That was the tone for the next 6 years. Not hostile. Hostile would have been easier to fight. Just a persistent, polished dismissal, the kind that never gives you anything solid enough to push back against, just makes you feel, dinner after dinner, that you were tolerated rather than welcomed. I remember one dinner, maybe a year and a half into the marriage, when I just closed my first contract with a regional carrier worth 6 figures, the kind of deal that would have meant something in almost any other room in the world. I mentioned it, carefully, the way you mention something you're proud of to people you already know won't be impressed. Diane asked, "Is that the trucking thing?" And before I could answer, Tanner cut in with a story about a boat he'd just chartered off Block Island, and the table moved on like I'd mentioned the weather. Elena squeezed my hand under the table that night, which I took, at the time, as her way of saying she saw what had happened and she was on my side. Looking back, I understand now that squeeze was never solidarity. It was an apology she never had the nerve to say out loud, a small private acknowledgement that let her avoid the much harder work of actually saying something to her family in the moment it mattered. There was another dinner, our second Christmas married, when Charles asked me directly, in front of the whole extended family, whether I'd ever considered a more stable line of work, something with a pension, in case the software thing doesn't pan out. I remember the specific silence that followed, not because anyone was shocked, but because everyone at that table had learned to treat comments like that as ordinary weather, the kind of thing you simply let pass over you without remark. I told him, evenly, that the software thing had grown 40% year over year for 3 straight years, and he'd nodded in the exact same tone he used when Tanner told him about fish he'd caught, polite, absent, already moving toward the next topic. It took me years to understand that these weren't oversights. They were a language the whole family spoke fluently, a way of reminding you, gently enough that you could never quite call it out directly, that you were not, and would never quite be, one of them. Elena and I got married 4 years ago at a small vineyard in Little Compton. Her parents paid for the venue, which I later understood was less generosity and more control, because for months afterward Diane referred to it as our wedding in conversation with her friends, like I'd been a guest at my own ceremony. I let it go. I let a lot of things go, because I loved Elena, and because I told myself that family opinions don't build a marriage, the 2 people in it do. What I didn't understand yet was that Elena had spent her entire life needing her family's approval in a way that ran so deep she didn't even recognize it as a need anymore, she just called it loyalty. And somewhere in the last 2 years, that need had started quietly working against me in ways I wouldn't understand until the night everything came apart. The Whitfield family reunion happens every August at the summer house on Ocean Avenue, a sprawling shingle-style place that's been in the family since 1961, the kind of house with a name instead of just an address. They call it Grey Gables. 40 to 50 relatives descend on it for a weekend every year, cousins and second cousins and family friends who've been coming so long they might as well be cousins too. I'd been to it every year since Elena and I got married. Every year I sat slightly outside every conversation, made small talk about boats I didn't own and clubs I wasn't a member of, and drove home each time feeling a little smaller than when I'd arrived. This year was supposed to be different, because this year I'd finally had the year that made the difference impossible to ignore, at least to anyone who was actually paying attention. My company closed a contract with a national retail distribution chain worth $4.2 million over 3 years, the kind of deal that got written up in 2 regional business journals. I'd hired 14 new people in 8 months. I'd bought us a house in Barrington with cash, no mortgage, because I don't like owing anyone anything I don't have to. And for the first time in 6 years of marriage, I thought maybe, just maybe, there'd be a dinner where Charles Whitfield asked me a real question about my work instead of steering the conversation back to boats. 3 weeks before the reunion, Elena came home from a dinner with her mother looking strange. Quiet in a way she usually wasn't. I asked her what was wrong and she said it was nothing, just tired. I let it go, because that's what I'd trained myself to do in that family, let things go, don't push, don't make it worse. That was my first mistake, and it wouldn't be my last, but it would be the last one I made without understanding exactly what I was doing. The invitation for the reunion came 2 weeks later. It came to Elena's phone as a group text in the family thread, the one I wasn't part of because Diane had never added me, another small detail I'd let go of years ago. Elena read it out loud to me at the kitchen counter. Saturday, August 16th, Grey Gables, arrived by 2 p.m., and then she said, quieter, it says immediate family and +1s this year. Small gathering. I didn't think much of it at the time. Small gathering, fine. Then she said something that should have told me everything. I think it might be easier if I just went alone this year, Marcus. Things have been tense with my dad. I asked her what things. She said it was complicated, work stress, her father's business, nothing to do with us. I believed her, because 6 years of marriage teaches you to believe your spouse by default, and because I genuinely did not want to be the husband who insists on being included in his own wife's family. But something in me, the same something that's built a company from $8,000 into a multi-million-dollar operation by paying close attention to details other people miss, didn't sit right. So 4 days before the reunion, I did something I'm not proud of and don't regret. I looked at Elena's phone while she was in the shower. Not to snoop on an affair, I want to be clear about that, because that's not where my mind went. I looked because something about the way she'd asked me to skip a family event felt engineered, and 11 years of running a business has taught me that when something feels engineered, there's usually a reason. The family group text went back 4 months. I scrolled up, and I found the conversation that changed everything I thought I understood about my marriage. 4 months earlier, Diane had written, "Can we please discuss the reunion arrangement before it becomes an issue? Charles doesn't want another year of awkward conversation with Marcus at the table, especially with the Marina situation the way it is." Elena had responded, "I understand, Mom. I'll figure out how to handle it." 2 weeks after that, Charles himself had written directly to Elena, not in the group thread, "Your mother and I would prefer this year's reunion stay immediate family only. No offense to Marcus, he's a good man, but you know how your Uncle Walter gets when outsiders are around and money comes up, and this year we need to discuss the Marina refinancing without complications. Please handle this delicately." There were other messages too, scattered across the intervening months, small enough on their own that I understood immediately why Elena had never mentioned any single one of them, but devastating in the aggregate the way a slow leak is more dangerous than a burst pipe because nobody notices the damage until the floor's already given way. Diane, in June, writing that she hoped Elena wasn't oversharing our situation with Marcus, some things really are family business. Elena's reply, 3 words, he doesn't ask. Charles, in July, forwarding a spreadsheet of the Marina's quarterly losses to Elena alone, with a note that said, keep this between us for now, and Elena's response simply a thumbs-up emoji, the kind of casual acknowledgement you'd give a coworker, not the kind of secrecy you'd expect from a wife hiding her family's financial collapse from the man she'd promised to build a life with. I sat on the edge of our bed reading that message 4 times before it fully landed. The Marina refinancing. I didn't know there was a Marina refinancing. I didn't know there was any financial trouble in the Whitfield family at all, because the entire architecture of that family's identity was built on the appearance that trouble like that simply didn't happen to people like them. I sat on the edge of our bed reading that message 4 times before it fully landed. The Marina refinancing. I didn't know there was a Marina refinancing. I didn't know there was any financial trouble in the Whitfield family at all, because the entire architecture of that family's identity was built on the appearance that trouble like that simply didn't happen to people like them. I remember setting the phone down on the comforter and just sitting there for a while, listening to the shower running down the hall, trying to figure out which feeling to trust first. There was anger, obviously, the kind that comes fast and hot and wants somewhere to go immediately. But underneath that was something slower and stranger, almost like grief, the specific grief of realizing that a version of your marriage you'd been quietly proud of, a version where you were patient and understanding and didn't make a fuss about being treated like an afterthought, had actually just been 6 years of your wife managing your feelings around her family's comfort instead of ever really defending you to them. I'd told myself for years that my patience was a virtue. Sitting on that bed, I understood for the first time that it might have just been permission I'd been unknowingly granting, over and over, to a pattern that was never going to change on its own. I kept scrolling, and I found the message that told me my wife had known about this for months and had chosen, every single time, to protect her family's comfort over telling me the truth. 3 weeks before the reunion, she'd written to her mother, I'll tell Marcus I think it's better if I go alone. He won't push back, he never does. He won't push back. He never does. 6 words that told me exactly how my wife had come to see me over 6 years of marriage, not as a partner she brought difficult things to, but as a problem she managed quietly, the way you manage an employee you don't fully respect but need to keep functioning. I didn't confront her that night. I want to explain why, because I know how that sounds. It wasn't fear. It was the same instinct that's made every good business decision I've ever made, which is that confrontation without full information is just noise, and I didn't have full information yet. I had a wife who was ashamed of me in front of her family, a father-in-law with some kind of financial trouble he didn't want me anywhere near, and an uncle named Walter who apparently got difficult when money came up around outsiders. I needed to understand what all of that meant before I said a single word. So over the next 10 days, I did what I do best. I built a picture, quietly, methodically, the way I'd build a due diligence file on a company before I decided whether to trust them with a contract. I called an old college friend, Priya, who worked in commercial lending at a bank in Providence. I didn't ask her to break any confidentiality, I just asked her, off the record, over coffee, whether the name Whitfield Marina Group meant anything to her in the current market. She got quiet in a way that told me plenty before she said a single word. That family's marina chain has 3 properties leveraged against a loan that's coming due in October, she said. I can't tell you numbers, Marcus, but I can tell you the coastal marina business up here has been bleeding for 2 years, storm damage nobody fully repaired, insurance premiums that tripled, and slip rentals that haven't kept pace. If they don't refinance or bring in new capital by fall, they're going to lose at least one of the 3 locations. I asked her, carefully, whether she knew who else might be circling that opportunity. She said the word that changed everything for me. Walter Whitfield, she said. Charles's older brother. He made his money separately, sold a chain of boat dealerships about 15 years ago for something in the 8 figures, and word around the lending community is he's been the one quietly propping up his brother's marina business through private loans for the last 2 years. Nobody talks about it at family dinners, I imagine, but everybody in commercial real estate up here knows it. Before I sat with any of that, I did something I probably should have done first. I called my older brother, Danny, who runs a fleet maintenance business out of Fall River and who has never once in his life pretended to be anything other than exactly what he is. Danny came over that same night with a 6-pack of the cheap beer he knows I secretly still prefer to the expensive stuff people bring to Whitfield dinners, and he sat at my kitchen counter and let me talk for almost an hour before he said a single word. "So let me get this straight," he finally said, turning the bottle slowly in his hands. "Her family's broke, or close enough to it that they need her uncle bailing them out, and instead of being straight with you about any of it, your wife decided the smart move was to keep you home like a scratch on a coffee table she didn't want the relatives to see." "That's about the shape of it," I said. "And you've spent 6 years sitting at that table getting talked down to by people who can't cover their own doc fees without a handout." He shook his head slowly. "Marcus, I love you, but I've been telling you for years that family isn't a title, it's a behavior. You built a real thing. 60 employees. You did that with your hands and your brain and about 4 years where you didn't take a paycheck so everybody else could get theirs. Those people wouldn't know how to build a lemonade stand without somebody's inheritance funding the lemons." I told him I appreciated it, but that it wasn't really about proving anything to the Whitfields. It was about what it told me that Elena had chosen, again and again, to protect their comfort instead of trusting me with the truth. Danny was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that stuck with me through everything that came after. "The money stuff, you can out-earn. You already have. It's the other thing that's going to be harder to fix, if it can be fixed at all. Because the money tells you what they think of themselves. But the way she talks about you behind your back, that tells you what she actually thinks of you. And those aren't the same problem, even if they showed up in your life on the same night." I didn't have an answer for him that night, and I still didn't have one 3 days later when I picked up the phone and called Walter Whitfield. But Danny's words were sitting in the back of my mind the entire time, the quiet, uncomfortable idea that I might be able to fix the family's finances, the family's opinion of me, even the reunion itself, and still come out the other side with a marriage that had already broken in a way no amount of fixing could really touch. I sat with that for a long time. Walter Whitfield. The uncle I'd met exactly 4 times in 6 years, always briefly, always at the edge of the family gatherings, a quiet, watchful man in his late 60s who never seemed to need the room's attention the way the rest of the Whitfields did. I remembered him once, 2 years earlier, asking me a single real question at a Thanksgiving dinner while everyone else discussed a regatta. He'd asked what problem my software actually solved, specifically, mechanically, and when I explained the routing algorithm and the fuel savings model, he'd nodded slowly and said, "That's a real business," before Diane changed the subject back to the regatta. I hadn't thought about that moment in 2 years. Now it was the only thing I could think about. Here is what I want you to understand about what happened next, because I know there's a version of this story where I look calculating, even cold, and I've made my peace with that, because the version where I stayed quiet and small for another 6 years was worse. For days before the reunion, I called Walter Whitfield directly. I'd gotten his number from Elena's contacts, another quiet violation of the marriage I was already deciding wasn't going to survive this, though I didn't have the full shape of that decision yet. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Marcus," he said, sounding mildly surprised. "Everything all right with Elena?" "Elena's fine," I said. "I wanted to talk to you about something, and I wanted to do it directly instead of through the family." There was a pause, the kind of pause I recognized because I make it myself in negotiations, the pause of a man deciding how much to reveal before he knows what you actually want. "All right," he said. "Go ahead." "I know about the marina refinancing," I said. "I know Charles doesn't want me at the reunion this weekend because he's worried about how it looks to have an outsider around while the family discusses it. I'm not calling to ask you for details about the business, Walter. That's not my place and it's not why I'm calling. I'm calling because I think I understand something about what's actually happening in this family that maybe nobody said out loud, and I wanted to hear it from you before I decide what I'm going to do about the fact that my wife has been managing me like a liability for the last 6 years instead of treating me like her husband. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then Walter Whitfield said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "Marcus," he said, "I've watched this family treat you like the help at every dinner I've sat through since you married my niece, and I've stayed quiet because it wasn't my place to fight a battle you hadn't chosen to fight yourself. But I'll tell you this much for free. I've put close to $4 million of my own money into propping up my brother's marina business over the last 2 years because he's my brother and because Diane would never let me hear the end of it if I let the family name take a public hit. And in 6 years, not one person in that family, including your wife, has ever asked me a single question about how I built what I built, the same way not one of them has ever asked you a real question about your business. They don't respect money that had to be earned. They only respect money that arrived by inheritance, and they've never once understood that mine didn't." I told him I was planning to come to the reunion anyway, invited or not, because I'd built too much and been dismissed too many times to spend one more year making myself smaller so his brother's family could feel comfortable. There was a long pause, and then Walter Whitfield said the words that would end up meaning more than either of us understood in that moment. "Come," he said. "It's time somebody at that table found out what happens when you underestimate the wrong man twice in one lifetime." I called Priya back 2 days later with a follow-up question, because 11 years of due diligence work had taught me that the first answer is rarely the whole answer. I asked her whether the bank had any record of who else had been approached about the marina refinancing besides Walter. She told me, carefully, staying just on the right side of what she was allowed to share, that Charles had quietly shopped the deal to 2 other regional lenders earlier in the year and been turned down both times, once because the collateral on the Newport property was overvalued on the family's own books by nearly 30%, and once because a storm surge 2 years earlier had never been properly disclosed on an insurance claim, which meant the actual condition of that marina was worse than anyone outside the family had any reason to know. If Walter weren't in the picture, Priya said, that family loses at least 1 marina by winter, maybe 2. I sat with that information the same way I sit with a supplier's financials before signing a contract, turning it over, looking for what it actually meant rather than what I wanted it to mean. What it meant was that the family that had spent 6 years suggesting I wasn't stable enough, wasn't self-sufficient enough, wasn't quite up to their standard of what a provider should look like, was itself 2 bad quarters away from losing a piece of the empire that gave them the standing to judge me in the first place. I want to pause the story here and ask you something, because I think it matters before I tell you what happened on that lawn. Have you ever spent years being quietly diminished by people who claimed to love you, not through cruelty exactly, but through 1,000 small dismissals that added up to the same thing? If this story is landing for you so far, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because this channel exists to tell these stories honestly, all the way through, and we're just getting started with this one. The morning of the reunion, I told Elena I was coming with her. She was standing at our bathroom mirror putting in an earring, and I watched her hand freeze mid-motion in the reflection. "Marcus, I told you, it's better if I go alone this year, my dad specifically Euro." "I know what your dad specifically said," I told her. "I read the messages. All of them. The ones about the marina, and the one where you told your mother I never push back. I have never in 6 years of marriage seen my wife go that pale that fast." She turned around slowly, and I watched about 4 different expressions move across her face in the span of maybe 3 seconds, shock, then something like fear, then something that looked almost like relief, the specific relief of someone who's been carrying a secret so long that even having it exposed feels lighter than carrying it another day. "Marcus, I can explain Euro." "You can," I said. "In the car. Because we're going to that reunion together, and you're going to tell me everything on the way, and then we're going to walk into that house as a married couple instead of you walking in alone to protect everyone's comfort except mine." The drive from Barrington to Newport takes about 40 minutes, and I spent every one of them listening to my wife explain, in pieces, with long silences between them, how 6 years of small accommodations had turned into a marriage where she'd stopped seeing me as someone whose feelings mattered as much as her family's comfort. The drive from Barrington to Newport takes about 40 minutes, and I spent every one of them listening to my wife explain, in pieces, with long silences between them, how 6 years of small accommodations had turned into a marriage where she'd stopped seeing me as someone whose feelings mattered as much as her family's comfort. I remember the specific quality of light that morning, the flat, hazy August sun coming off the bay as we crossed onto Aquidneck Island, and how strange it felt to be driving toward a place I'd been dreading all week while my wife cried quietly in the passenger seat beside me. I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road, partly because that's simply how I drive, and partly because I needed somewhere neutral to put my attention while she talked, somewhere that wasn't her face, because I wasn't sure yet what I'd see there and whether I was ready to see it. She told me about the marina, about how her father had been quietly bleeding money for 2 years, about how Walter had been covering losses that nobody in the family would admit existed because admitting it meant admitting that the Whitfield name wasn't as solid as everyone needed it to be. She told me that Charles had specifically said, 3 separate times over the last 2 years, that having me at family financial discussions made him uncomfortable because he was worried I'd judge the family for needing help, for not being as self-sufficient as they presented themselves to the world. And she told me, finally, quietly, staring out the passenger window instead of at me, that somewhere in the last 2 years she'd started to believe her family's version of me instead of her own. "What does that mean?" I asked her. "Your family's version of me?" "That you're a good provider," she said, "but that you'll never really understand people like us." That's the phrase my mother uses. People like us. And I've started saying it too, in my head, even when I hate myself for it. I didn't say anything for a long time after that. I drove, and I let the silence do what silence does best, which is make people sit with the weight of what they've just said instead of letting them talk their way past it. We pulled up to Grey Gables at 2:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the arrival time in the group text, and I could see through the front windows that the lawn behind the house was already full, 40 or 50 people scattered across the grass in the kind of casual, expensive clothing that costs more precisely because it's designed to look like it doesn't. I parked the car myself instead of letting the valet take it, because I wanted a minute, just 1 minute, to look at that house and remember every dinner I'd sat through feeling like an intruder in my own marriage before I walked back into it one more time, on my own terms this time. I want to tell you what it felt like walking up that gravel path holding a bottle of wine nobody wanted, because I think it matters that I felt every bit of the humiliation before Walter Whitfield stood up and changed the entire shape of the afternoon. Preston saw me first, from across the lawn, and I watched him nudge the person next to him, and I watched that recognition spread across the yard the way bad news spreads at a dinner party, quietly at first, and then all at once. By the time I reached the edge of the patio, half the yard was watching me, and Preston had already said the words that started the laughter. Oh my God, he actually came. I stood there and let it happen. I didn't flinch, I didn't turn around, I didn't reach for Elena's hand for support because I needed her to watch me stand there on my own for just long enough to understand exactly what her silence over 6 years had cost me. Charles Whitfield was at the head of the long table set up on the lawn, and I watched him set his jaw the way men do when a plan they'd carefully arranged is coming apart faster than they can manage it. Diane's laugh was the loudest one, a bright, brittle sound that I understood now was less about genuine amusement and more about performing for the rest of the family exactly how they were supposed to feel about me. And then Walter Whitfield stood up. He didn't stand up fast. He stood up the way a man stands up when he spent 40 years in boardrooms learning that speed reads as anger and stillness reads as authority. He set his glass down on the table with a small, deliberate click, and in a voice that wasn't loud at all, a voice that simply expected to be heard, he said, "Sit down. Before you all embarrass yourselves in front of the only person at this table who's actually built something." The laughter didn't fade slowly. It stopped, all at once, the way a room stops when someone says a name out loud that everyone had silently agreed not to say. Preston's mouth was still half open from whatever joke he'd been about to add. Diane's hand had frozen halfway to her wine glass. Charles was staring at his brother with an expression I can only describe as a man watching a bomb he'd known was buried somewhere finally go off in exactly the wrong moment. "Walter," Charles said, his voice tight, this isn't the Timmy Euro. It's precisely the time, Walter said, still standing, looking around the lawn at 50 relatives who had gone completely silent. Because I've sat at this table every summer for years and watched this family laugh at a man who built a company from $8,000 into something employing 60 people, while half the people laughing at him have never built anything that wasn't handed to them by somebody who came before them. Marcus didn't inherit a single dollar of what he has. Do any of you understand that? Do any of you understand what that actually takes? Nobody answered him. Nobody moved. Elena was standing beside me, and I could feel her trembling, though I genuinely couldn't tell in that moment whether it was shame for her family or shame for herself. And here's the part that I think most of you don't know, Walter continued, and I watched Charles's face go the color of the tablecloth, because Charles has worked very hard to keep it quiet. This family's marina business has been underwater for 2 years. I've put nearly $4 million of my own money into keeping it afloat, because he's my brother, and because none of you can stand the idea of the Whitfield name looking anything less than untouchable. And in all that time, not one of you has asked me a single serious question about how I built the money I've been using to save this family, the same way none of you have ever asked Marcus a serious question about his business, because none of you actually respect money that had to be earned. You only respect money you were born into. And I am done pretending that's an acceptable way to run a family. I want to be honest with you about what I felt standing there listening to that. Part of me felt something close to vindication, the specific, quiet satisfaction of watching someone finally say out loud what you felt for 6 years and been too polite to say yourself. But a bigger part of me felt something heavier, because I understood in that moment that Walter wasn't just defending me, he was detonating something in his own family that had been building pressure for 2 years, and once it went off, there was no putting it back together the way it had been. Charles stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the flagstone. This is not the conversation to have in front of 50 people, Walter. No, Walter said, it's exactly the conversation to have in front of 50 people, because you've spent 2 years hiding it from all of them while letting your daughter's husband take the brunt of this family's insecurity about money instead. I'm tired of it, Charles. I'm tired of funding a family that can't extend basic respect to the one person who married in and actually built something with his own hands. Charles turned toward me then, and for the first time in 6 years I watched something in his face that wasn't dismissal, something closer to being cornered. Marcus, this isn't personal, you have to understand the position we've been in. It's been personal every single time you asked me if I'd considered a more stable line of work, I said. It's been personal every Christmas you moved the conversation to Tanner's fishing trips the moment I mentioned a contract. You don't get to call it business now that the roof is coming off the business you didn't want me anywhere near. He didn't have an answer for that. I watched him open his mouth once, close it again, and sit back down slowly, the particular posture of a man who has just realized the argument he came prepared to make no longer applies to the room he's standing in. Preston, who'd started the whole thing with his 4 words in the doorway, tried to laugh it off, the way people do when they sense a room turning against them and think humor might still save it. Come on, Uncle Walter, we're just having fun, nobody meant anything by €1. You meant plenty by it, Preston, Walter said, turning to look at him directly, and Preston's face went the particular shade of red that comes from being addressed by name in front of 50 people you were just trying to impress. You've had 4 words ready in your pocket for this man every summer since he married into this family, and you've been waiting all year for the chance to use them. That's not fun. That's cruelty with better tailoring. Diane stood up next, her face flushed with something between fury and humiliation. Walter, you don't understand the position this puts Charles €1. I understand it perfectly, Walter said. It puts him in the position of having to admit that the family he spent his whole life presenting as self-made is actually one refinancing crisis away from losing 2 of its 3 marinas, and that the only reason it hasn't already happened is because his older brother, who built his own money without a cent of family help, has been quietly bailing him out. That's the position it puts him in. And instead of gratitude, or humility, or any kind of honest reckoning with that, this family spends its energy laughing at a man in a doorway holding a bottle of wine. Tanner tried once to defend his father, standing halfway up from his chair. "This is a family matter, Uncle Walter, it doesn't need an audienciero." "It already has one," Walter said, gesturing at the whole silent lawn. "You made sure of that yourselves, every time you laughed at a man for having the nerve to show up somewhere he was told he wasn't wanted. You don't get to complain about the audience now that the audience isn't laughing at the person you wanted them to laugh at." Tanner sat back down without another word. I noticed, in that specific silence, that not one person on that lawn, not one cousin, not one family friend who'd been laughing 30 seconds earlier, said a single thing in Charles or Diane's defense. 50 people, and the only sound was the faint clink of ice settling in somebody's glass and, somewhere behind the house, a lawnmower 2 properties over that hadn't gotten word the party had stopped being a party. I looked at Elena. She was crying, silently, the kind of crying where you're trying so hard not to make a sound that your whole body shakes with the effort. I didn't reach for her. Not yet. Because there was a second half of what I needed to say, and I needed to say it while the whole lawn was still listening. "Walter," I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me, "thank you. But I need to say something myself, because this isn't just about the marina, and it isn't just about the wine bottle." Every eye on that lawn turned to me. I looked at Charles Whitfield directly. "For days ago I found out that you and Diane specifically arranged to keep me away from this reunion, not because of the marina situation alone, but because Elena told her mother, quote, 'He never pushes back.' That's how my wife described me to her family, after 6 years of marriage. Not as a partner. As a problem she'd learned to manage quietly. I want everyone at this table to understand that I didn't come here today to embarrass anyone. I came here because I've spent 6 years shrinking myself at your family's request, and I'm done doing it." I turned to Elena. "You should have told me about the marina the moment you knew. You should have told me your father didn't want me here. Instead you told your mother you'd handle me, like I was an appointment you needed to cancel. I need you to understand that whatever happens with your family after today, the thing I actually can't move past is that you chose their comfort over honesty with me, over and over, for years, and I only found out because I went looking." Elena said my name, once, quietly, and didn't have anything else to say after it. That silence told me everything the drive from Barrington hadn't already told me. I want to pause the story again, because I think this is the moment worth sitting with. Have you ever found out that someone you loved had been quietly managing you instead of trusting you, and had to decide in real time, in front of an audience, whether to make a scene or hold your ground calmly? Let me know in the comments what you would have done differently in that moment, and if you're still with me, stick around, because what happened in the weeks after that reunion is the part of this story that actually changed my life. I didn't stay for dinner. I told Elena I was driving home, and I asked her, in front of everyone, whether she was coming with me or staying with her family. I want to be clear that I wasn't trying to force a public ultimatum for effect. I asked because after everything I just heard and said, I genuinely didn't know the answer, and I needed to know it before I got back in that car. She came with me. She didn't say a word for the first 20 minutes of the drive, and when she finally spoke, she said, "I don't know how to fix 6 years in one conversation, Marcus." I told her I didn't either, and that I wasn't sure fixing it was actually the right goal anymore. I told her I needed time to figure out whether I even wanted to try, because trust, once you understand it's been managed instead of given honestly, doesn't come back just because the person who broke it is sitting next to you looking sorry. We didn't separate that night. I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story where everything resolves in one dramatic afternoon. What happened instead was slower and, in its own way, harder. The drive back to Barrington from Newport was almost entirely silent, the two of us sitting with the wreckage of an afternoon that had exposed 6 years of quiet dysfunction in front of 50 witnesses, and I remember thinking, somewhere around the bridge, that silence had never felt so loud in my life. We tried counseling for about 10 weeks. Elena worked hard in those sessions, harder than I expected her to, and there were moments where I believed we might actually find our way back to something real. But underneath all of it was a question neither of us could fully answer, which was whether 6 years of her choosing her family's comfort over honesty with me had built a pattern too deep to undo, or whether it was simply a season of weakness that the right amount of honesty could repair. Our counselor, a soft-spoken woman named Dr. Renata Ford who worked out of an office in East Providence, told us in our 4th session that what she was seeing wasn't really a marriage problem, it was a boundaries problem that had been misfiled as a marriage problem for years. "Elena," she said one Tuesday afternoon, "when you describe managing Marcus's presence at family events, I want you to notice the word you keep using. Managing. Not including. Not defending. Managing. That's the language you'd use for a difficult employee, not a husband." Elena had cried in that session too, and told Dr. Ford that she didn't know how to stop, that the reflex to smooth things over for her parents ran so deep she sometimes did it without noticing until it was already done. I believed her when she said that. I still believe it now. But believing someone is telling you the truth about a pattern isn't the same as believing the pattern is going to change, and 10 weeks into counseling, I still hadn't seen a single moment where she chose me over her family's comfort when the two were actually in conflict. There was a session in week 8 where Dr. Ford asked Elena directly what she would have done if I hadn't found those messages on my own, if I'd simply stayed home the day of the reunion the way she'd originally asked. Elena was quiet for almost a full minute. "I think I would have gone," she finally said, "and I think I would have had a nice weekend, and I think some part of me would have been relieved that I didn't have to manage the two things at once." I remember sitting in that office chair feeling something settle in my chest, not anger exactly, more like clarity, the specific, cold clarity you get in a negotiation when the other side finally says the true number out loud instead of the number they've been performing for the last hour. What actually ended the marriage wasn't a single dramatic betrayal. It was smaller than that, and in some ways sadder. 3 months after the reunion, Elena's mother called her, crying, saying that Charles had finally agreed to sell one of the 3 marinas to cover the refinancing, and that the family needed to gather again to process it together. Elena asked me to come to that gathering. I said I would, on one condition, that she tell her mother directly, in advance, that I was coming and that there would be no repeat of what happened at Grey Gables. She agreed. And then, for days before that gathering, I found out from Walter himself, not from my own wife, that she had quietly told her mother she'd figure out the seating so it wasn't awkward, the same phrase, almost word for word, that had started this whole thing 3 months earlier. That was the moment I understood something I hadn't fully accepted yet, which is that the pattern wasn't a mistake she'd made once under pressure. It was simply how she operated, a reflex built over a lifetime of needing her family's approval more than she needed to protect the people who loved her. I didn't confront her with anger. I told her, calmly, over dinner at our kitchen table, that I was filing for divorce, and that it had nothing to do with the marina or the reunion or any single event, and everything to do with the fact that I couldn't spend the rest of my life married to someone whose first instinct, every single time, was to manage me quietly instead of stand beside me honestly. She cried. She asked if there was anything she could do. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't think there was, not because I didn't love her, but because 6 years had shown me exactly who she became under pressure, and I didn't believe 3 months of counseling could undo a lifetime of conditioning that ran that deep. I told her I hoped she'd find a way to separate her own worth from her family's approval someday, because until she did, no marriage was going to survive the weight of it. Diane called me twice in the 2 weeks after I filed. The first call, she was conciliatory in a way I'd never once heard from her in 6 years, telling me she understood if I was angry, that families say things they regret, that surely we could all sit down together and find a way through this like adults. I told her, politely, that I appreciated the call, but that this had never really been about one bad afternoon on a lawn, it was about a pattern that had been building for 6 years, and that I didn't think a family dinner was going to undo it. The second call, 4 days later, was a different tone entirely. She told me I was making a mistake I'd regret, that Elena had given up things for me too over the years, that I was punishing her daughter for her parents' financial troubles and that history would remember me as the man who abandoned his wife the moment her family needed support. I let her finish. Then I told her, calmly, that I hoped she'd think, at some point, about the 6 years her family spent making it clear I'd never really belong, and ask herself honestly whether that was the behavior of people who deserved my patience now that the roles had reversed. She didn't call a third time. I told her the truth, which was that I didn't think there was, not because I didn't love her, but because 6 years had shown me exactly who she became under pressure, and I didn't believe 3 months of counseling could undo a lifetime of conditioning that ran that deep. I told her I hoped she'd find a way to separate her own worth from her family's approval someday, because until she did, no marriage was going to survive the weight of it. I called Danny that same night, after Elena had gone to stay with a friend for a few days to give us both some room. He didn't say I told you so, which I appreciated, because plenty of people in his position would have. He just asked me how I was doing, actually doing, underneath the calm voice I'd apparently been using with everyone else that week. I told him I felt strange, lighter in a way I hadn't expected and sadder in a way I had. He said that sounded about right for the end of something that had been dying slowly for a long time before it finally stopped breathing. You did the hard part already, he told me. You did it back on that lawn, in front of 50 people who'd spent 6 years underestimating you. Everything after that was just paperwork catching up to a decision you'd already made. I've thought about that phrase more times than I can count since then, paperwork catching up to a decision I'd already made, because I think it's true of almost every ending that actually matters. The real decision rarely happens in the lawyer's office. It happens quietly, months earlier, in a kitchen, or a car, or standing in a doorway holding a bottle of wine nobody wanted. The divorce took 8 months to finalize. Rhode Island isn't a state that makes these things complicated when both parties are being reasonable, and to Elena's credit, she didn't fight me on anything. She didn't ask for a share of the business, because she'd never been involved in building it and she knew a court would see through any claim to it in about 5 minutes. I gave her the house in Barrington, because I'd bought it with my own money and I didn't want to live somewhere that had absorbed the last 3 years of that marriage's slow unraveling. I moved into an apartment overlooking the water in Providence, close enough to my office that I could walk there in the mornings, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I slept through the night without the low hum of managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own. I gave her the house in Barrington, because I'd bought it with my own money and I didn't want to live somewhere that had absorbed the last 3 years of that marriage's slow unraveling. I moved into an apartment overlooking the water in Providence, close enough to my office that I could walk there in the mornings, and for the first time in longer than I want to admit, I slept through the night without the low hum of managing someone else's comfort at the expense of my own. Those first few months alone were quieter than I expected, and not in a way that felt lonely so much as in a way that felt, oddly, like exhaling after holding my breath for 6 years without fully realizing I'd been doing it. I started running again in the mornings along the waterfront, something I hadn't done consistently since before I met Elena, because somewhere along the way running had turned into one more thing I quietly gave up time for in service of family dinners and obligations that were never really mine to begin with. I got back into the habit of cooking, actual cooking, not the careful, impressive dinners Elena's mother expected when we hosted, but simple things, the kind of food my own mother used to make growing up in Pawtucket, and I remember standing at my stove one Tuesday night, no one to perform for, no one to impress, thinking that this, exactly this, quiet and unremarkable and entirely mine, was the first time in years I'd felt like the life I was living actually belonged to me. Walter Whitfield called me 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. I hadn't spoken to him since the reunion, mostly because I didn't want to put him in the position of choosing between his niece and a man he'd only really known for 6 years. But he called anyway, and the first thing he said was, "I owe you an explanation for putting you in the middle of my family's mess." I told him he didn't owe me anything, that what he'd said on that lawn was true whether or not it was convenient, and that I respected him more for saying it out loud than I would have if he'd stayed quiet to keep the peace. There was a pause, and then he said something I didn't expect. "I've been watching your company for 2 years, Marcus, ever since that Thanksgiving conversation about your routing software. I think what you've built is genuinely good, and I think it's underleveraged. I'm looking to put capital into something that isn't propping up my brother's mistakes for once. Would you have any interest in a conversation about growth capital, a real partnership, not family money with strings attached?" I want to tell you honestly that I didn't say yes immediately, because 11 years of building something with my own hands has taught me to be careful about whose money I let anywhere near it, especially money that came from a family I'd just spent 6 years being quietly humiliated by. But I met with Walter 3 times over the next month, looked at the terms carefully, had my own attorney go through every page of the proposed agreement, and eventually agreed to a deal that gave him a 12% stake in exchange for $8 million of growth capital, money that let me open 2 new offices, in Hartford and Worcester, and double my client base within 18 months. I want to tell you honestly that I didn't say yes immediately, because 11 years of building something with my own hands has taught me to be careful about whose money I let anywhere near it, especially money that came from a family I'd just spent 6 years being quietly humiliated by. But I met with Walter 3 times over the next month, looked at the terms carefully, had my own attorney go through every page of the proposed agreement, and eventually agreed to a deal that gave him a 12% stake in exchange for $8 million of growth capital, money that let me open 2 new offices, in Hartford and Worcester, and double my client base within 18 months. The first of those 3 meetings happened at a diner in East Providence, not a boardroom, which I noticed and appreciated. Walter ordered black coffee and eggs and spent the first 20 minutes asking me questions nobody in his family had ever bothered to ask in 6 years, questions about churn rate, about how I'd structured the sales team's commission, about which of my 61 employees I trusted to run the Hartford office without me looking over their shoulder every week. When I finally asked him why he cared so much about the mechanics of it, he set his fork down and said, "Because money without understanding is just gambling with extra steps, Marcus, and I didn't build what I built by gambling. I built it by understanding things better than the man across the table from me." I told him that was the first time in 6 years anyone in his family had talked to me like my business was something worth understanding rather than something to be politely endured, and he nodded like that didn't surprise him at all. The second meeting was with my attorney present, a careful, methodical woman named Patricia Alves who'd been advising small businesses in Rhode Island for 20 years and who told me afterward, once Walter had left the room, that in her experience family money almost always came with strings that showed up 18 months later disguised as a reasonable request. I told her to build the agreement so there were no strings possible, no board seat with outsized voting power, no right of first refusal that could box me in if I ever wanted to sell, no clause that let Walter's estate inherit influence over decisions if anything ever happened to him. He agreed to every one of those terms without negotiating a single point, which told me more about the kind of investor he intended to be than any amount of conversation could have. Walter never once brought his brother's family into a single conversation about the business. He asked sharp, specific questions about margins and client retention, the same way he'd asked about my routing algorithm 2 years before anyone in that family had bothered to take me seriously, and I understood, working with him, exactly what Elena had meant when she said her family only respected money you were born into. Walter had never been born into his money at all, and it was probably the reason he was the only one of them who ever really saw me. I ran into Charles Whitfield once, about a year after the divorce, at a business dinner in Providence that neither of us had expected the other to attend. He looked older than I remembered, the specific tiredness of a man who'd had to sell off a piece of his family's identity to keep the rest of it standing. He came over to my table, which surprised me, and said, quietly, that he owed me an apology for how I'd been treated at his table for 6 years. I told him I appreciated it, and I meant it, though I also told him, gently, that an apology a year after a divorce doesn't undo 6 years of dinners, it just tells you something true about timing. He nodded like he understood that completely, and we didn't speak again after that, though I heard through Walter, occasionally, that the marina business had stabilized, smaller than it used to be, but honest about what it actually was for the first time in years. Elena and I are not in contact anymore, beyond the logistics of a divorce that had, thankfully, very little to untangle. I heard, through mutual friends about a year later, that she'd started seeing a therapist specifically to work through what she called her approval patterns, which told me she'd finally started asking the question I'd hoped she'd ask, even if it came too late to save what we'd had. I hope she finds her way through it. I mean that honestly. I don't carry anger toward her anymore, mostly because anger takes energy I've learned to spend building things instead. My company, if you're curious, closed out last year at just under $19 million in revenue, with contracts across 4 states and a growing regional footprint that Walter's capital made possible in a fraction of the time it would have taken me alone. My company, if you're curious, closed out last year at just under $19 million in revenue, with contracts across 4 states and a growing regional footprint that Walter's capital made possible in a fraction of the time it would have taken me alone. I think about one moment from that growth more than almost any other, because it tells you something about what I'd actually built while the Whitfields were busy deciding I hadn't built anything at all. When we opened the Hartford office, I promoted a woman named Renee Castillo to run it, someone I'd hired 6 years earlier as a dispatch coordinator answering phones for $9 an hour more than minimum wage because it was all I could afford to pay anyone in those first lean years. She'd worked her way up through every level of that company because she was sharp and relentless and because I'd made a point, from the very first year, of promoting from inside rather than importing people with fancier degrees and thinner loyalty. The day I handed her the keys to that office, she cried in the parking lot, and told me it was the first time in her working life that anyone had bet on her before she'd proven she deserved it. I thought about the Whitfield dinner table in that moment, about 6 years of being told, implicitly, that what I'd built wasn't real, wasn't serious, wasn't the kind of success that counted at their table. And I thought about Renee, and about the 13 other people I'd promoted from entry-level roles into real careers over 11 years, and I understood, standing in that parking lot, exactly whose definition of success I should have been measuring myself against the whole time, and it had never once been theirs. I bought a house on the water in Bristol last spring, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, but because I earned it, dollar by dollar, decision by decision, over 11 years that nobody in that family ever bothered to understand until an uncle who'd built his own fortune the hard way stood up at a table and said the quiet part out loud. Here's what I've come to believe, looking back at that afternoon on the lawn at Grey Gables. I think most families don't actually laugh at people because they think less of them. I think they laugh because it's easier than confronting the parts of themselves that don't measure up to what they're laughing at. Every person on that lawn who laughed when Preston said he actually came was, in some small way, laughing to cover the discomfort of standing next to a man who'd built something real with his own 2 hands while most of them were still living off decisions somebody else had made 2 generations earlier. It's a lot easier to mock the outsider than to sit with the quiet, uncomfortable question of what you've actually built yourself. And I think Walter Whitfield understood that better than anyone else at that table, because he'd lived both sides of it. He'd built his own fortune from nothing, the same way I had, and he'd spent decades watching his own family fail to respect that the same way they failed to respect it in me. When he stood up that afternoon, he wasn't just defending a nephew-in-law he barely knew. He was finally saying out loud something he'd needed to say about his own family for 30 years, and I happened to be standing in the doorway at the exact moment he decided he was done staying quiet about it. I ran into Elena once, about a year and a half after the divorce, at a farmer's market in Providence on a Saturday morning. I hadn't expected to run into anyone I knew, let alone her. She was standing at a stall buying tomatoes, and we saw each other at almost exactly the same moment, that particular half-second where you both consider pretending you haven't, and both decide, almost simultaneously, that pretending would be worse. "Marcus," she said. "Hi. Elena." I asked how she was doing, and I meant it as more than the empty pleasantry it usually is, because some part of me genuinely wanted to know whether the year had been kind to her. "I'm okay," she said. "Better than okay, some days." She told me she'd left the gallery and started her own small consulting practice helping nonprofits with exhibition design, something she'd always talked about wanting to do but had never quite gotten around to while she was managing everyone else's expectations of her. I told her that sounded like good work, and I meant that too. She asked about the business, and I told her about Hartford and Worcester, about the $8 million, though I didn't mention where it had come from, and I watched something complicated move across her face when I described the growth, something between pride and grief, the specific expression of a person realizing exactly how much bigger a life can get once it stops being managed for someone else's comfort. "I heard about you and Uncle Walter," she said eventually, carefully. "My dad doesn't love it, but he doesn't really have room to say much about it anymore. How's your dad doing?" "He sold the 3rd marina in the spring," she said. "Kept the other 2. He's smaller than he used to be, but I think, honestly, he's less stressed than I've seen him in years." Turns out pretending to be bigger than you are takes more out of a person than just being what you actually are. I told her I was glad to hear that, and I was. There wasn't much anger left in me by then, mostly because anger, I'd learned, takes energy I'd rather spend on the 61 people who worked for me and depended on me showing up clear-headed every morning. We talked for a few more minutes, mostly about nothing, the specific, careful nothing of two people who used to know everything about each other and now only know the outline. Before she left, she said, "You always meant it, you know. Every time you said you believed in something, you actually meant it." I think that's the thing I understood too late. I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I did, though I also understood, watching her walk away with her bag of tomatoes, that some understandings only mean something when they arrive on time, and hers, like a lot of things in that marriage, had arrived a little after it would have mattered. I don't regret showing up uninvited that day. I know there's a version of this story where the better choice was to stay home, protect my dignity by simply not putting myself somewhere I wasn't wanted. But I've thought about it a lot since, and I don't believe dignity works that way. I think dignity is something you have to insist on sometimes, in the room, in front of the people who've spent years denying you had any, even when it costs you something to do it. It cost me a marriage, in the end, though I've come to believe that marriage was already hollowed out long before I walked up that gravel path with a bottle of wine nobody wanted. What it gave me back was something I hadn't realized I'd lost somewhere in those 6 years of quiet accommodation, which is the simple, uncomplicated experience of being taken seriously by the people around me, of building a life where nobody needs to stand up and defend my right to be at the table, because I'm not spending my energy shrinking myself small enough to fit into rooms that were never built to hold me comfortably in the first place. I think about Preston sometimes, oddly enough, more than I think about Charles or Diane. I heard, through Walter, that he never quite recovered his standing in the family after that afternoon, that the 4 words he'd used to start the whole thing followed him around family gatherings for a long time afterward, a joke that had curdled into something nobody wanted to be reminded of. I don't take any particular satisfaction in that. If anything, it's a reminder of how easily any of us can become the person standing in the doorway, mocked for something we didn't choose, if the room around us decides that's the easier story to tell. I hope Preston learns something from it eventually. I hope, honestly, that all of them do, though I've stopped waiting around to find out. If you've ever been the person standing in the doorway while a room decides whether you belong there, I hope this story reminded you of something worth remembering, which is that the people who laugh loudest at what you've built are usually the ones who understand, somewhere underneath it, exactly how much they haven't built themselves. Keep going anyway. Show up anyway. Let the people who actually see you be the ones who decide whether you were ever really an outsider at all. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me about a time someone stood up for you when you least expected it, or a time you had to stand up for yourself in a room that had already decided how to see you. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, because we tell real stories here, the kind that don't wrap up neatly in 15 minutes, and we're just getting started. Thanks for listening, and take care of yourselves out there.